So a very, very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for registering and attending this session. We're going to try to keep it to a very tight hour, and looking forward to exchanging with you. And we'll dive right in. I will now pass over to Jeanette Moritz, who's the head of the Learning and Development Unit. So welcome once again, and over to you, Jeanette. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alfred, and good afternoon, good morning, and a very warm welcome to this Learning Exchange webinar series. And our session today, Access 101, a Shared Responsibility. And this session is being brought to you in collaboration with the Policy Advice and Planning Section, OAD in New York. And I'm so delighted to have all of you joining us today from across the different field offices, the HQ branches. We had quite a high registration, and I see that our participant numbers keep growing, and so it's showing very healthy interest in the topic of access. And indeed, we see this webinar as a good opportunity to take some focus space on how-to learning to grow our knowledge and skills in this important area of OCHA's work, to exchange on the issues and lessons of good practices in the operational context. And as well, we hope that there's connections made to build the OCHA community. And our topic today on access, indeed, it's a vital area of OCHA's work, and it's obvious that without it, we do not deliver to those in need. And as the title of the webinar implies, access is a shared responsibility requiring a whole of office approach where we all have a role in contributing. And to assist us to explore this area, go deeper in our knowledge and building our skills, I am super delighted to have Aurélien Goulet, who is the Chief of PAPS, along with colleagues Sophie Solomon, Omar Kurdi, Amanda Schmidt, and who are here with us and will take us through the session. And so a huge thanks to the four of you for making the time to share with us today. I also just want to mention, with thanks to those of you who responded to the registration survey on your learning interest, what you hope to gain. And so those of you who did raise the issues, put the questions out, these have been shared with the facilitation team, and we'll be taking them up, as well as the opportunity for further exchanges with all. And so I'm very happy to now hand over to Aurélien, who would make some opening remarks to set the stage, and then Sophie and Omar will take us through as the main facilitators for the session. Thank you so much, and wishing a fruitful session. So over to you, Aurélien.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you to your team for really helping us facilitate this discussion. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Very nice to be with you today. As Alfred mentioned, we just have one very short hour, and Sophie and Omar have many things to share with you, so I will be extremely brief. I would just like to stress that access is one of the few issues expressly mentioned in OCHA's mandate. I would add that no other humanitarian organization has been given such a mandate, and as you stressed, Jeanette, access is a prerequisite for people to receive the assistance they need. It's also essential to make sure we can protect these people from the risks they're facing in a humanitarian emergency. So it's a huge responsibility for OCHA, and it's important we get it right. And getting it right starts with some basics. Basics being that we all need to be clear within OCHA on what OCHA's mandate and role is on access. And then once we have clarified this, it's important we acknowledge that it's a shared responsibility, and that's the point of this webinar, and that we start, each of us, in our offices collectively, but also individually in our function and our responsibility to really start thinking and articulating what it means concretely for us on the day-to-day. So that's partly what we're going to try to achieve today. And with no further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Sophie and Omar, who are going to take you through this coming hour. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Aurélien, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today to speak about access, and building on the remarks of Aurélien as an introduction, I will highlight what we're going to discuss today, and with my colleague Omar and Amanda, we're happy to interact with you, so don't hesitate to use the chat. Omar and Amanda will monitor the chat and answer any question. And of course, we will have time for Q&A, hopefully at the end. So don't hesitate to also ask questions at the end. So today, after this introduction, we want to have like a brief overview of the role of OCHA in humanitarian access, then go a bit deeper into the tools and services that we can offer to the humanitarian community on the ground, and then discuss a bit the role of OCHA in terms of humanitarian negotiation and what is the comparative advantage of OCHA when it comes to negotiation on access. And because we are all busy with the COVID-19 pandemic, the idea was also to contextualize the discussion and to have just like one or two slides to discuss what OCHA is doing on access in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak, and more especially when it comes to access, what are the different services and tools that we have offered to the humanitarian community. So this is the outline for today's session, and we hope like that during this 1 hour, we'll cover this different aspects. So let's start with the role of OCHA on humanitarian access. And first of all, let's start with the basic, which is the definition of humanitarian access. So I'm just wondering if someone has an idea of what is the definition of humanitarian access, if you want to type it in the chat, or if someone wants to come in and share his or her definition of humanitarian access. Do we have a volunteer, or do we have someone in the chat willing to volunteer? No, not yet. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, so here is the definition. So the definition of access, and I'm sure most of you know that, is really twofold. It's our ability as humanitarian actors to have access to the affected people, but also, and the most important probably, is the ability of the population affected by a crisis to have access to humanitarian assistance and services. So this is what we need to keep in mind when we're talking about humanitarian access and making sure that we all have this common definition of humanitarian access when speaking to partners and also when implementing our work. The second part of the definition is often forgotten, so it's really important also to keep in mind that we need to put the population in need at the heart of our discussion and making sure that they have access to the assistance that we can deliver. So that was just like a brief introductory remark on the definition, so that we're making sure that we're all speaking about the same issue when it comes to access. I think both Janet and Aurélien mentioned it. I mean, humanitarian access is definitely a prerequisite to effective humanitarian action. Without access and without a quality of access, we can't really deliver on humanitarian assistance, and we cannot also ensure the principled delivery of aid. So humanitarian access is really the prerequisite of everything that we're doing. And most of the time when we're discussing about access, it's not only about having access one time to the community, but it's also to have access in a qualitative way, making sure that the way that we have access to the population is principled and we can have access in a timely manner, that it's safe. We have seen a lot of attack and threat of attack against humanitarian workers. So when we're advocating for access, we're also very much insisting on the safety of our access. And of course, unimpeded, which means like that we don't really have like unnecessary restriction that will block humanitarian access. Of course, we know that in certain circumstances, access could be temporarily withheld, and we know that in times of conflict, it could be very challenging. But most of the time when we're like discussing access, we're making sure that we are like focusing on timely delivery, safe delivery of humanitarian assistance, and unimpeded. So this is just a bit of context to making sure that we are like are okay with all the definition. So what is the role of OCHA on access? So as Aurélien mentioned, OCHA is the only organization that has been mandated to work on access. And this is especially mentioned in the General Assembly Resolution 46-182 under the definition of the terms of reference of the Emergency Relief Coordinator. So if you're looking at the terms of reference, it includes to allow and facilitate access, including through negotiation. And this is what gives like OCHA the mandate to work on access. This mandate is also like reflected in the terms of reference of the humanitarian coordinators, and therefore OCHA at field level with its role of supporting the humanitarian coordination and supporting the HC has a role to play when it comes to access. So we are mandated to deliver on access. So how do we do that? So the 5 priorities on access for OCHA are highlighted in the small diagram that you can see on the right of your screen. So we have a role to play, of course, in building a coherent and coordinated approach on access. I mean, that's the role of OCHA. The role of coordination also applies to access. So we have a role to play in coordinating access. And we will see in another part of the presentation, how do we do that? We also have a role in terms of monitoring access and trends. We need to know what is the situation. We need to be able to provide the right picture and tell the right story about access, because this will help us for advocacy and negotiation. So to do advocacy and negotiation, we need to have an evidence-based approach. So we need to know what's happening on the ground. So a big component of OCHA's role on access is about monitoring access and trends. We also have a role to play in terms of capacity building, making sure that partners are familiar with humanitarian principles, that they know how to do negotiation. So really a role to play in terms of also building the capacity of the humanitarian community to help us having this collective approach on access. And finally, there is a role to play in strengthening the normative framework on access. And this is done at HQ level, and this is done like through discussion, like the General Assembly, when we have the General Assembly events, when we have the ECOSOC events, and making sure that all documents and all policy discussion on access are also reflecting the position of OCHA. So these are like the main role of OCHA, and we will see further in the presentation how this translates into concrete activities and action, and what could be your role in supporting the access agenda, whether you're an HAO, if you're an information management or a public information officer. We all have a role to play in supporting these 5 priorities on access, and we will detail a bit more what are the activities and tools we can offer to achieve these 5 priorities on access. So the role of OCHA on access is both at global level and at the country level. So at the global level, OCHA clearly has a role to play in terms of advocacy, and advocacy at the most senior level. And for example, our ERC, when briefing the Security Council about situations like Syria and Yemen, will always make reference to access, and always making reference to like this safe, timely, and unimpeded access to population in need. So we really have this high-level advocacy, and of course also like private advocacy, bilateral engagement from the ERC with member states to make sure that access is supported in countries where we have like challenges. So a big effort on advocacy at global level. And all this advocacy effort is definitely coming from the efforts that OCHA is doing at the country level. So at the country level, OCHA facilitates and coordinates the efforts to establish and maintain access. And also OCHA is really like monitoring and reporting on the situation. So the monitoring and reporting of the situation at country level is feeding directly into the advocacy at global level. So all the efforts that are done at country level really like play a role into the overall access at the global level. So it's really like a complementary approach, and the global level for sure like feed into also the field level, the result of public and private advocacy at strategic level combined with high level negotiation definitely have an impact on what's happening on the ground. So it's really like a strong interplay between the global level and the field level when it comes to access. So we all have a role to play, HQ, country level, and in the second part of the presentation, we're going to go a bit deeper into the country level to really better understand like what OCHA is doing at country level and what are the tools and services OCHA could offer to the humanitarian community. But before doing that, we want to hear from you, and I will hand over the mic to my colleague Omar to hear a bit more about your experience of access in your respective duty station. And Omar, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Good morning, everyone. I will ask to control so I can share my screen. Okay, perfect. Thank you. If everyone can go to slido.com, SLI.do, there you will be asked to share, to enter a code. You'll enter the code that you can see now, 35137, and that will allow you access to the questions. Can someone confirm if they see the questions?
Yes, Omar, we see the questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. If you're on the website, you should see the first question pull up, which is our poll, which reads, according to you, what role does your office play in humanitarian access? And if you think that it plays multiple roles, choose the one that you think is most important or impactful. This is just a general poll to see what the participation thinks and where your headspace is currently. The different options are monitoring, engaging with parties, providing guidance. Okay, so we see that there are some responses coming in, 7 responses here. Monitoring access is doing the best. Coordinating access efforts and engaging with parties to a conflict. 13 responses. We'll wait a few more minutes. Or team. So nobody thinks that providing guidance to the HCT is the most important or impactful role in access. That's interesting. Okay, well, I think we have 14 responses. Are there any more? No. Oh, there we go, 15. Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think you already see here, majority are choosing that monitoring access is the most important sort of role that an office can play on access, and this is something that we definitely support and something that we can get behind. But it's also interesting to see that some other roles that we think are also very important, like public and private advocacy, something that happens maybe more at HQ, or guidance that a lot of our access focal points in the field actually do to the HCT and the humanitarian community are seen as less important or impactful. And maybe this is because monitoring access is the most visible role that OCHA can play in the field offices or in different offices, because usually monitoring access then produces some sort of visual reports. Maybe that's a reason. But I'd also invite anybody who responded, if anyone wants to come in and comment on why they chose what they did, feel free to do so now. I'm going to deactivate the poll, and I'll return the presenter rights. No one wanted to come in to talk about why they chose what they did as the choice?
Okay, so maybe we can continue. So thank you, Omar, for the result of the online poll. And I think it was really interesting to note that most of the colleagues highlighted the role of OCHA in monitoring access, because as you mentioned, Omar, it's probably the most visible tool that we are producing in terms of access. And we have seen a lot of different maps highlighting the access constraints in the different country offices. So I think it would be interesting now to go a bit deeper into the different tools and services that we actually deliver on access, or we could potentially deliver on access. So all these tools and services are actually highlighted in the minimum package of services on access that OCHA released last year in January 2019. It's available on the OCHA Hub, and happy to share a copy with the colleague if you can't find it. I think at the end of the presentation, you have a link to the minimum package as well. So this is where you will find like all the different tools and services that we're going to present in the coming slides. These tools and services really highlight what OCHA can do to be more systematic and predictable on its way to approach access. What we have observed in the past is that most of the country offices were developing their own ideas about access, their own strategy about access. And I think it was, most of the time it was like a very good idea, but probably confusing for partners in a sense that it was not systematic. So from one country to another country, it was really different the way that OCHA was approaching access. So the idea of the minimum package is really like to collect what is out there in terms of best practices and to provide guidance for colleagues in the field in terms of templates so that they don't have to start from scratch or to reinvent the wheel when actually like everything is already like out there. So this minimum package really highlights 4 or 5 different aspects of access that would be really important for a country office to focus on. So the first one, because we're OCHA, because our main job is to do coordination, on access it's the same. It's like, how do we ensure that humanitarian actors have a strategic and coordinated approach on access? And we're going to see like the different tools that we can offer on that. The second one, and I think you highlighted it in the survey we just did, is how do we make sure that access constraints are known and monitored? So what's happening on the ground? What are the access constraints? The third one is about advocacy. So how can we advocate for access? Who should do it? What kind of tools should we use to advocate for access? And the fourth one is really the operationalization of access. How do we facilitate access? When do we do negotiation? What kind of tools are out there to do that? So now in the 5-10 coming minutes, the idea is really to go a bit deeper into these different activities and the different tools that are available to all OCHA country offices to achieve these 4 objectives. So the first one, how to have a strategic and coordinated approach on access. We have different tools. They are highlighted here on this slide. The first one is the humanitarian access strategy. Some country offices have decided that the best way to come together with a joint approach on access is to have an access strategy that could be monitored either by the humanitarian country team or by the access working group. The access strategy can take different shapes. Sometimes it's like a very elaborated access strategy. Sometimes it's just like a roadmap and a priority for the country team for the next 6 months. So the humanitarian access strategy has been developed in multiple countries now and really served as a kind of roadmap for the humanitarian country team in order to see like what are the priorities in terms of access in a given country or in a given area. Sometimes only part of the country that require access focus. And then it also highlight what are the roles and the responsibility of the different members of the humanitarian country team in achieving this objective. So we do have templates. We do have like good example of successful access strategy that led to positive outcomes. So if your country office is interested in developing an access strategy, I mean, the policy advice and planning section stands available and ready to support and share templates if needed. Another way, which could be actually like supporting the development and implementation of the humanitarian access strategy, is to establish a humanitarian access working group. And we have seen like recently a lot of access working group being developed, reporting mainly to the humanitarian country teams, but sometimes also to the intercluster. And the idea is to have a dedicated forum to discuss access issues and really to find a way to work together with humanitarian partners, local NGOs, international NGOs, UN agencies, to find a way to improve access, to maintain and sustain access in areas where access is currently restricted. We have different types of access working groups. We also have like local access working groups. Some colleagues at sub-office level have also developed humanitarian access working groups to make sure that they can also improve access at the local level. So the access working group could be an advisory body to the humanitarian country team, providing advice to the HCT and the HC on access issues, can help develop key messages, can help develop an access strategy, but could also be a very much an operational one and decide together how to have access to a specific area, how to make sure that we can have access to this area where like a conflict started. How can we make sure that we have the right interlocutors around the table, how we can make sure that we can deliver access. So it really depends on the needs of the country team. Terms of preference exist for humanitarian access working group. We have some templates and we have like different examples of success in terms of humanitarian access working group. Another way of having a coordinated approach is to develop joint operating principles or ground rules, code of conduct, red line. There are different terminology for this one. But the idea is to come together as a humanitarian community and to agree on what we agree to do and what we disagree to do in terms of engagement with the different actors. So this has been developed in countries where there were a lot of like competition amongst humanitarian actors, where there was no coordinated approach, and the lack of coordination around access and negotiation triggered some principles being undermined, triggered some issues because some organizations would agree on certain aspects, such as sharing beneficiary lists, for instance, and other humanitarian actors would not, and then it would trigger some issues with the authorities. So the idea of the joint operating principle, the ground rules, or the red line is really to have like one common document that creates a kind of framework of engagement that all humanitarian actors abide by. So this has been developed in contexts such as Syria, Yemen, but we have like multiple examples where this has been adapted, and it could be adjusted as the situation requires. The idea also to make sure that we have a coordinated approach on access is really to bring on board other organizations. And more UN agencies and also NGOs have humanitarian access advisors. So the idea is really for OCHA to make sure that we bring a network of access practitioners and that we have like the right picture on what's happening, and making sure that when there is a decision taken at the HCT level in terms of access, we make sure that we use this network of access practitioners to make sure that all humanitarian actors are aware of the decision and that the decision is implemented. And then lastly, it supports coordination. It's actually the training of humanitarian actors to make sure that when we're speaking about access, when we're speaking about negotiation, all our partners are aware of what we're talking about, that all humanitarian partners are fully aware of like humanitarian principle and the operationalization of humanitarian principles. Sometimes we're also doing training about humanitarian dilemma. So this has been a request in a lot of countries where humanitarian principles were challenged and where humanitarian actors felt like that maybe they needed some training on how to deal with this different dilemma. So we have different tools that could really help us making sure that we have a coordinated approach. What we have observed is without a coordinated approach, like the chance of success in terms of access are really low, because most of the time we will see that the different parties, the different authorities will use the competition among humanitarian actors as a leverage for their own benefit. And that would undermine our capacity to have access. So really like bringing these coordination skills to the access discussion is really something that we are promoting, and I think that's the role of all HAOs. I mean, it goes from like the sub-office colleagues to like the head of OCHA and the humanitarian coordinator. Like as much as we can promote a coordinated approach on access, the more successful we will be in terms of access outcome. So really coordination comes probably first on the list of things that we should do as OCHA in order to ensure that we have this coordinated approach. What is really interesting is that this coordinated approach is actually closely linked to this monitoring approach. So that's the second objective of an OCHA country office. And the access constraints are often known by actors, but the role of OCHA is really to make sure that we have a systematic way of collecting information and also analyzing the information. It's not only about collecting information, it's like, what does it mean? And this is where like we are working with colleagues from information management in helping us trying to find the right way to visualize the access incident or the access analysis that we're doing. So what are the different tools that we can use when it comes to monitoring access constraints? The first one, which seems quite obvious, but which actually is rarely like updated in a country office, is to make sure that we have like a context and stakeholder analysis, really understanding the difference from one region to another, from one community to another, making sure that we have an updated stakeholder analysis, that we keep track of all the meetings that we had with a specific stakeholder, making sure that when the head of office speaks to a specific stakeholder and then the head of sub-office will follow up, that we know what was agreed and that we keep track of the different discussions. So really like a focus on the basics. I think everybody would agree that, of course, we should have a context and stakeholder analysis. The reality is that in most of the country offices, it's outdated or not necessarily shared widely within the country office. So we all know the sensitivity about keeping information about context and stakeholder in some country offices, but I think the role of OCHA is really making sure that the way we engage with the different actors that have leverage on access is really like monitored and that we're tracking and we're keeping records of our engagement. The other product that we're developing are very much access focused, and I think most of you have probably seen this access incidents monitoring. The idea is really to collect from the partners what are the different access incidents that they have observed in the past week, in the past month. It depends how often we are collecting data. So this is good to give us an idea of what is the most important access constraint in a country. So for example, South Sudan, if you're monitoring the incidents, you will clearly notice that violence or threat of violence against humanitarian personnel is the #1 constraint that colleagues are facing in the ground. In other contexts, it would be conflict. In other contexts, it would be a bureaucratic impediment. It would really vary from one context to another. And it could be useful to have an idea of what are the incidents in your respective country office so that it can feed into advocacy. But then if we want to really have like a better understanding of access, most of our colleagues are now shifting to this approach, which is the severity mapping. And we are really encouraging colleagues to focus on this severity mapping. So the idea is really to assess where access is the most severely constrained. So it's really more a perception approach, a more qualitative approach. The monitoring of incidents is much more a quantitative approach. So it's really balancing this quantitative approach on access with the qualitative approach of access. And all this will translate into access reports and products, and this is where colleagues from information management are really coming into the picture, and they are like really helpful in organizing our analysis into a visual that would be really helpful to advocacy, but also to a better understanding of the dynamics, because, for example, we can overlay access with population in need, we can overlay access with number of organizations present on the ground. So really the idea is access is not an end in itself, it's really like something that we need to have in order to deliver, but it's really good when we're doing the analysis to combine the access analysis with population in need, with like needs, with the response. So really like focusing on the humanitarian delivery and seeing like where we can have an impact if we're doing more negotiation, if we're doing more advocacy to help the response. So monitoring the access constraints and doing the analysis of access constraints is really like a key component of an OCHA response. And I think this is what was clearly highlighted in the survey that you did before. The third objective is really about the advocacy. So the advocacy is really at different level, but at field level, of course, a lot of advocacy is happening. You have advocacy, private advocacy, you have also like bilateral engagement with different parties and with the local authorities. And the advocacy is really like feeding into all the situation report, all the public information products, and generally the public information officer at a country level really has a role to play in convening the right message about access. And this is generally like fed with all the information that we will be collecting from the access monitoring and reporting. And of course, you also have high-level statement by the ERC and the HCs based on the findings on the ground about access, and depending also on the situation and if there is a need to escalate the issue and the advocacy at a higher level. And most of the statement of the HCs, especially in conflict-affected area, would include some elements of access. And to do so, I mean, of course, all these high-level statements need also some evidence-based narrative. So it's very important that the monitoring of access constraints and the analysis is accurate, so that we can provide a really like detailed points for this high-level statement and the HCs. So as we've seen, like HAO definitely have a role to play on the objective 1, information management officer definitely have a role to play in objective 2, and public information officer have definitely a role to play in objective 3. And then we have objective 4, which is really the operationalization of access. So how do we facilitate access, including through negotiation? So it will really depend from one country to another. The idea is really, in general, the sub-office having the lead in terms of access. They are the one with the direct engagement with the actors on the ground. And most of the time, the head of sub-office will have a key role to play in facilitating access at field level. Of course, there will be also like the support to high-level access negotiation strategy at country level. So whenever the humanitarian coordinator is engaged in high-level negotiation, OCHA will support and provide information. One key function in terms of facilitating access is civil military coordination. Our colleagues working on civil military coordination have this expertise in engaging with armed actors, and in areas where access is constrained because of conflict or because of insecurity or because of the presence of armed actors, the expertise of the civil military coordination officer is clearly an asset to OCHA to help us unblock access. So this function is really critical to the achievement of objective 4. And of course, I mean, facilitating access is really about this regular engagement with key access influencer. And it's the role of OCHA to always be in touch with like all the different actors that could potentially have a leverage. So it could be with member states, could be with non-state armed groups, could be with the private sector, and of course with the communities. So the more we are closer to the community, the better we can work on acceptance and hopefully like make sure that we can maintain access. So as you could see, clearly like all function in OCHA have a role to play in access. And I didn't mention like also like the support function, but from the driver to the head of office, everybody has a role to play because maintaining access is really about also how we are perceived. And I think it's the role of all OCHA colleagues, regardless of their function, to make sure that the mandate of OCHA is well understood and that the behavior and the attitude of OCHA colleagues also help us like gaining this acceptance and ultimately contributing to access. So these are the different tools. It's not exhaustive, so a lot of other tools and services are highlighted in the minimum package of services on access. So if you have any questions, please feel free to refer to it. I just want to, because I'm conscious of the time as well, want to discuss briefly about humanitarian negotiation and then go into the specific contextualization of access in COVID-19. So what is the role of OCHA in humanitarian negotiation? This has been asked by a lot of colleagues from the field. And of course, OCHA has a role to play in humanitarian negotiation. It's clearly mentioned in the terms of reference of the Emergency Relief Coordinator. But what we do see is like we do not want like OCHA to just monopolize all humanitarian negotiation. The idea is really to also identify when OCHA has a comparative advantage to lead the negotiation. We have a comparative advantage in a lot of situations because we have different levels of engagement, because we can engage from the sub-office level to like the head of office, the HC, and even the emergency relief coordinator if we want to engage at a more strategic and global level. But we're also fully aware that in some countries or in some part of the countries, some other organization could have like a better comparative advantage. Like for example, UNICEF is well established in a specific area, they are well known by partners, and there is an access issue. So maybe it could be more relevant for this specific situation for UNICEF to take the lead. Then what is the role of OCHA in this kind of situation? I mean, the role of OCHA is to make sure that the negotiations that are done by UNICEF is actually for the benefit of the whole humanitarian community, and that we have this really coordinated approach when it comes to negotiation. So sometimes like OCHA is taking the lead, and sometimes OCHA is in the backseat and just like advising other humanitarian organizations, advising the HC, or making sure that the negotiations are done under the framework of agreed joint principle or agreed red lines. So we can have like really like this different kind of role, and it would really depend where we have this comparative advantage, what about like our stakeholder analysis, and also about our engagement strategy. So we have seen OCHA like taking the lead on negotiation for interagency convoy, for example, in Syria. But at the same time, we have seen WFP taking the lead in other issues where like their food distribution was opening doors for negotiation. So it's really like depending on the context and making sure that regardless of who is negotiating, it's done under like a common agreed framework and that all partners are on board when it comes to this negotiation. So now I think it's time for a small quiz before we go into a bit more of access in the context of COVID-19. So Omar, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. So we're going to be using the same code and the same website. So you can find it here, sli.do, and the code 35137. My colleague Amanda has also put the code in the chat if you missed it. I'll be sharing my desktop again and doing the same thing. This time we're going to be doing a small quiz. Can someone confirm that they see the quiz on this screen and also on the screen that they're doing the quiz on?
Yes, Omar. Yeah.
Okay, great. people joining the quiz now. We'll wait for more people to join. Now you are competing against each other, so let your competitive spirit show through. We have 11. We have many more participants, so maybe we'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes. 15. If we get to 20, maybe we'll start. Okay. All right, so let's start the quiz then. So the first question is, who is responsible for humanitarian access at OCHA? You have 4 options. There's only one correct answer. After we get 20 responses, you'll be able to see the leaderboard. If you were paying any attention, you know it's not D, which is the last option. So it's one of the first 3. $15, $16. $18 responses, 20 responses, 21 responses. Okay. I'm going to lock voting and we're going to show the results. Okay, wow, 82% got it correct. Good job. It's OCHA. It's an OCHA responsibility, and everyone really at the organization has a role to play in humanitarian access. So for those that responded correctly, thank you very much. For those who didn't, we're happy to debate why you thought the other answers were correct. Yep, all of OCHA is responsible, 82%. Great. Okay, so we'll move to the second question. Which of the following is not one of the 5 priorities on access? Building a coherent and coordinated approach, monitor access and trends, deliver assistance, advocacy and negotiations. So one of these 4 is not one of the 5 priorities on access. There are other priorities that are not mentioned, but one of these is the odd one out. $17 responses. Last time we had 22, so maybe we'll wait a bit. 19. 20. Okay. One more. Okay, great. We're going to lock the voting and we're going to show the results. Okay, so 87% thought that delivering assistance is not one of 5 priorities. 9% that monitoring access and trends is not one of the 5 priorities, and advocacy negotiations 4%. The correct answer, as many have answered, is delivering assistance, yes. Although the OCHA, although one of the priorities on access is one of the results might be that assistance is delivered. It's not an access priority. Maybe we'll show the leaderboard. Okay, so now a lot of people have gotten both correct answers, but the quickest person has been Laura. So Laura's number 1. Congratulations, Laura. We have one more question. Okay, so third question, last question. OCHA does not have a mandate to talk to non-state armed groups on NCSG. Is this true? Is this true except those labeled as terrorists? Is this true only if member states ask us? Or is this false? 22. For the interest of time here, which we're quite stuck on, so we'll lock voting and we'll show the results. So 83% have answered false, 4% have answered true, but only if member states ask us. 9% have answered true except those labeled as terrorists, and 4% have answered true for all cases. And we'll see the correct answer is false. The ERC has a mandate to engage in negotiations with whoever is required to talk to for unlocking access. It depends on the situation, but that includes non-state armed groups. Okay, we'll show the leaderboard, and congratulations, Laura. You were the fastest in answering by 4 seconds, and then followed by Khalid and Iman. I will now stop the quiz, deactivate the quiz, and pass on the presenter back to Sophie. If I can see how to do that. There we go.
Thanks, Omar, and thanks to all of you for participating in this quiz. It was just like a fun interaction to make sure that we have all of you on board and that we can summarize some of the things that were discussed in the previous slides. So now what I want to do, just before we go into the Q&A, is just to contextualize the discussion in the context of like the COVID-19. So I think when it comes to COVID-19, I mean, of course, access was one of the key components of OCHA response, especially because of the restriction of movement into the country, with all the flights being suspended, the borders being closed, but also because of the restriction of movement within the country imposed by the authority because of public health measures. So access was really a key component of the access response from the very onset of the COVID-19 outbreak, together with all the other functions, of course. So I just wanted to highlight some examples of how OCHA is responding to the COVID-19 access constraints. So the first one is really at HQ and in the field, like we have really like tried to adapt like the response to the changing context. And this was including like finding innovative way to deliver and access people in need. So from one country office to another, there were like a lot of like different innovative approach to make sure that the humanitarian community can have access to assistance and to have access to the people, and that the people can have access to assistance. So a lot of focus was really on like how to adapt operation, and I think all OCHA colleagues were involved in that. In terms of coordination, for sure, I mean, the idea was to make sure that all existing coordination tools that we have highlighted in the presentation before were adjusted to the COVID-19 response. So, for example, when we have an access strategy, is how to make sure that the access strategy is adapted to the COVID-19 response. If we have joint operating principle, making sure that everybody is aware of it and how this joint operating principle could and should apply to the context of COVID-19, and also like access working group, making sure that COVID-19 is a standing agenda item in all the access working groups. So for example, in Afghanistan, they clearly have developed like a new like access strategy related to COVID-19. They have developed like new way of also like monitoring access. So really like looking at the different tools that were already out there, like making sure that they are adapted to the COVID-19 response. Of course, there is also like colleagues like working on the finance part of the house that were also contributing to the access agenda. And for example, part of the self allocation has been targeted to access enabling projects and contributing notably to the WFP airlift operation, like all the movement of humanitarian goods, PPEs, but also humanitarian personnel to all country offices have been partly funded by the SURF. Of course, information management, collecting information about access. I mean, all colleagues at field level are monitoring the access constraints that they are facing at field level and how this impact the response to COVID-19. And also at HQ level right now, we are working with colleagues from OPT to develop a comprehensive overview of the access constraints worldwide and trying to provide a better picture of where are the challenges. And of course, this would feed into the advocacy. So there is a high-level advocacy to help fast-track the movement of humanitarian personnel and goods. There were different initiatives. The SG sent a letter to all member states asking them to help fast-track the movement of humanitarian and health personnel and goods. The ISC at the principles level developed key messages on access. We have a lot of different HC interaction with the authorities to make sure that humanitarian staff are considered as critical staff and therefore are allowed to move. And we have seen in a lot of country offices humanitarian facilitation letters or humanitarian exemption being applied to allow the continuity of operation. So really advocacy is the priority focus right now. For sure, it's also making sure that the way that we are delivering assistance is also safe and making sure that we have the required PPEs and we are taking the right measure to deliver, but making sure that humanitarian staff could continue their operation. So right now we keep on advocating with the authorities, making sure that these exemptions are applied, making sure that quarantine measures that sometimes apply in specific area of the country or at country level do not undermine our capacity to respond to people. So really access in the context of COVID-19 is really just highlighting the different tools and services that we had and making sure that we adapt our response to this ongoing pandemic. And most of our colleagues have done that, not only the access colleague, but the whole OCHA office. And I think the key message is really all colleagues have a role to play. We have seen information management, public information, HAO, civil military coordination, and also the finance people. So I think everybody in the house has a role to play when it comes to access. And this was clearly highlighted in the COVID-19 response where everybody contributed to the access agenda. And the access focal point in the country office as the role of coordinating the access efforts and making sure that everybody and all the functions contribute to the overall access agenda, which is generally under the direct management of the head of office. So the idea is really how an office, how OCHA can contribute to the access agenda, bringing the comparative advantage of each of its functions. So these are some of the documents that have been produced in the context of COVID-19, so highlighting what has been done in Afghanistan, as I mentioned before. So that's it for me in terms of access. It was really just a brief overview of what OCHA can offer to our partners on the ground in terms of access. If you want more information, you have a list of additional resources here, and we're going to share the PowerPoint presentation. I know that we're running out of time, but I think we may have 5 more minutes for a question and answer. That's it for me. I will hand over the mic maybe to Alfred.
Yes, thank you so very much, Sophie. So the chat function is open. If you can also paste your questions there. And I'll be handing over to Jeanette shortly for the end remarks. There'll also be a poll that's function, so please don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat function. Over to you, Jeanette.
Okay, thank you, Alfred, and huge thanks to Sophie, Omar, and Amanda. I do just want to leave some space for any Q&A. So, colleagues, take advantage of the moment. If you have any questions, comments, we welcome them. So we'll go for a few more minutes before we close.
So, Jeanette, if I may, I see that there was a question about the role of humanitarian financing in access issues. So actually, as I mentioned, I mean, in the context of COVID-19, we have seen that much more at HQ level with the initiative of supporting the WFP airlift operation. But actually, in other country offices, in more normal time, I would say, we have seen that the humanitarian finance colleague can support by supporting access enabling projects. So, for example, we have seen them like through the SURF supporting UNDSS in having dedicated local security advisor that would support humanitarian actors only in terms of making security assessments to new area, and through this funding expand the footprint of the UN system. But it could also like to support like activities from local actors, because the result of the access severity analysis would highlight that local actors in this specific area have a better access. So it's really this communication between the access people and the humanitarian finance, and to make sure that we can also help them in terms of like strategy, priorities, and which organization by their presence could allow and facilitate access in the long term. So definitely humanitarian finance people also have a role to play, and apologies if I didn't really highlight that in the first slide. Over to you, Janet.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments?
I think there's one more question, Jeanette, from Ali, asking how do you aggregate country-level access to global level?
Okay, Sophie.
That's actually a challenging one, and the idea is really not to aggregate, but really like to have a look at each country individually and trying to develop a score or like an index and trying to see which country has the most severe access constraint based on their own analysis. So it's really like what we do not want is really like necessarily to compare Venezuela with Iraq and Yemen with Myanmar, because each country is extremely different. So the idea is to have an overview of all the countries, and if you like select a country, for example, on a visualization tool, you will have a better understanding of what are the challenges in this country. I think we should be very cautious indeed, like in terms of aggregating information from different country offices, because constraints are very context specific. And even in one country, from one area to another, like if we're looking at Myanmar, for instance, the constraints are very different. So when it comes to access, we're really focusing on a qualitative analysis, and which requires sometimes a bit more narrative than we would like. But I think access is all about the nuance. So that's what we're trying to achieve when we're trying to have a global overview of access issues.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions, remarks before we close? And of course, this doesn't need to be the last conversation. You will have the contact details of the PAPS colleagues. Oh, there's something coming. All right. So from Rania, we're reviewing our resource mobilization strategy in the Gulf region. Which section in OCHA can we reach out to help us incorporate access challenges? Sophie.
We are the one. So thanks, Rania, for the question. So yes,
we'll
PAPS.
make sure that the contact details are included in the message that we'll send out following this webinar with the presentation and the recording, as well as any other resources. So on that note, I would close the session. And a huge thanks, Sophie, Omar, Amanda, for this intensive but very rich session on a big topic. And I'd like to also thank all of you, all the participants, for your participation today. As I said earlier, go further in your learning. There are resources that we're going to be sharing with you. It's an important topic. We've really just hit the surface, as the title was Access 101. And so please do continue your learning in this area so that we are fully informed and we can apply the principles, the lessons to our respective functions and the work that we do, picking up on the important concept that access is a whole OCHA responsibility, a shared responsibility. So just now, yes, very good. We have the polling. It's important that we have your feedback on this session, what was useful to you, areas where you'd like to know more, any kind of follow-up support. So please help us out. Just take a second to complete this poll. And while you're doing that, I would encourage that you join us for other webinars in this series. The next one is on operationalizing accountability to affected people. That's taking place on the 26th of August, and the registration information is on the OCHA Hub Learning Center. I hope you've checked out that hub lately. We're always updating the information. And please don't hesitate to get in touch with us for anything we can do to support you in your learning and know your learning champion in your office. So, Alfred, how are we doing on the polling here?
Yes, we got about a minute to go. Some colleagues are still answering. So just take a few minutes, just 4 questions. If you could just take a few seconds to quickly let us know what you think. If you also have some questions, suggestions, please don't hesitate to use the chat in sharing these. About 50 seconds to go.
That's great. So colleagues, just finish up and I'll close the webinar for today. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, evening, and I look forward to the next time we're together. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So we've got about another 30 seconds to go. And we will, of course, be sharing the results of the poll. Still see this. Good. We're still getting some more responses. 10 seconds to go. For those in progress, could you please, yes, wrapping up here. Okay, looks like time's up. Yes, so as mentioned earlier, I'll be sharing the recording with everyone. We see that there were 19 people 19 colleagues who actually took the survey. And just taking a second to show this. There we go. Good. So you can see the survey results on the right-hand side.
Okay, so knowledge came up. What was the most relevant? Knowledge comes up. Mm-hmm. But we also have all of the above, including the discussion and access to experience. Sorry, Alfred, I don't have the questions fully. Do you have them in front of you?
Yeah.
Read out.
Yes. So the first one says, what is the most relevant to you in this webinar? So that's what you just mentioned. That let me just scroll up. Yes. So knowledge coming up on top. Then the second question was, to what extent did the webinar contribute to your understanding of Humanitarian Access 101? And it says to a great extent came up on top, which is good. Thank you. And third question, will you use what you have learned today? And majority say yes. 18 said yes. 1 person not sure. And the last question, what additional support would you like to receive on humanitarian access? And this is a bit split, so follow-up webinars and additional resources and tools. So it was split between these two, follow-up webinars and additional resources and tools.
Okay.
Yep.
That's great. So on that, thank you again. Excellent results to the top colleagues, so we'll be in touch on follow-up, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.